Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. So tonight's topic is silence. And we just had mostly silent meditation before the talk. And interestingly, too, we've also been on a silent retreat here at the monastery. So this practice of being in silence, noble silence, is one that you'll hear spoken about often by Buddhist practitioners, because the Buddha himself talks about silence quite a bit. And for this talk in particular, I wanted to bring up the wholesome, noble silence that the Buddha talks about in the discourses, and also shine some light on ignoble silence, or silence that's not so helpful, not so useful. So to start with the positive, what is noble silence? And noble silence is the kind of silence that allows us to turn inward and take a look at this body, this mind, this heart. Take a look at what's going on in this conglomeration of so many different things. So when we're engaged in different activities, whether it's work, social engagements, or participating in something, playing a sport, watching a show, doing some kind of activity that requires our attention and also perhaps requires us to be doing or saying something. When we're engaged in these kind of things, then it's very difficult to be able to fully and wholeheartedly observe what's occurring in our physical and mental experience. And it's not that there's anything wrong with doing these activities, but rather it's recognizing that we want to make sure that we have time for both. That we have time for spending quality moments with our friends and family, that we have time for getting the work that we need to get done, that we have time for doing all the different tasks that we need to do out in the world, but that we also take time to go on retreat, essentially, that we all take time to batten down the hatches and look at what's going on within this body and mind. So even taking, say, 20 or 30 minutes in the morning or in the evening to meditate can be a form of going on retreat. What are you retreating from? You're retreating from the exterior world. You're retreating from the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches that normally occupy our attention throughout the day. And instead, we're looking at what's alive in this moment within our body and mind. And it's interesting because oftentimes we'll find that what's happening in our body and mind did not even appear before we sat down, before we closed our eyes. We didn't even know that it was there. Sometimes this deep-seated anger just bubbles up in meditation. So we think that meditation is supposed to be peaceful and calm and serene, and all of a sudden we're agitated and angry. And all we can be with is this heat, this rage that's filling the body. But most of the time, that feeling, whether it's anger or sadness or agitation or excitement, most of the time when it appears in meditation, it's because we're finally taking a moment to take a look at it. It was probably there much earlier on throughout the day, for some weeks maybe, for some months or even some years. But it's only when we finally have a moment to sit down and just be with what is that we're able to see the things that are lying beneath the surface. So it's like looking into a pond that's been churned up by the rain, perhaps. It's very murky when there's all this activity happening that's just distorting the surface. But when the rain stops, when the movement stills, when things become calm, then we can see more clearly. And unfortunately, oftentimes what we see is not so pleasant. Oftentimes what we see is quite disturbing, actually. But it's a good thing that we can see these unpleasant, unwholesome frames of mind. Because if we can see them, then that means we can do something about them. So cultivating this silence of the senses, for example, is one of the things that allows us to still the surface of our minds. When we don't have to be caught up in listening to music, watching a show, having a conversation, doing some activity, when we can just stop, then we are able to look more deeply at things. So this is the benefit of silence, the kind of silence that creates seclusion, that creates solitude. We quiet down the things outside of us so that we can tune into the things that are happening within. So in some ways, we turn down the volume on the outside world, but we turn up the volume inside. And initially, this kind of silence may be quite uncomfortable, especially if we've spent lots of time cultivating habits of constantly interacting with others, perhaps constantly being stimulated by things, constantly being engaged with all the different activities that are on sale throughout the day. It can be quite disconcerting then to suddenly drop into an environment where all of that's cut off and the only thing you have is yourself. So in that case, I recommend not just going cold turkey if you are trying to cultivate some silence, but to start with little bits and pieces here and there. Something like 10 minutes of meditation each day. I've always enjoyed meditating around sunrise, for example, because things are quiet at that time of day. People are still in bed for the most part. The activities of the day, both in the urban environment as well as the natural environment, are pretty still. And so you can get your day started in this quiet, contemplative sort of environment and really take advantage of the silence that comes with that. You can also experience the same thing at the very end of a day. It's just that, at least for me, it tends to be more difficult because I've spent the whole day with all sorts of thoughts, ideas, and feelings tumbling around in my head. So first thing in the morning, especially if I'm diligent to not, just start up the same thought-producing machine, then I can start with a quiet, peaceful, and calm mind. But in this case, you do what works. When are those moments when your mind is most peaceful? Is it in the morning, the afternoon, at night? And to use those little moments to touch silence in a small way, and over time to increase that, maybe even working up to going on a retreat, whether self-retreat or somewhere else as well. So this kind of silence is then what allows us to develop deeper levels of concentration, samadhi. It's also what allows us to enter the high states of absorption, of mental stillness, the jhanas. Allowing the mind to be still, allowing the mind to be quiet. That's really all it takes, even though it's much more difficult than that. And it's important here also to recognize that this kind of silence should feel nourishing, should feel peaceful. So we're not trying to cultivate an aversive silence. We're not trying to cultivate the state of mind that gets angry at every little sound around us, because truth be told, it's impossible to stop sounds. Instead, what we do within ourselves is stop paying attention to them, stop being pushed and pulled around by them. So the silence that we're really trying to cultivate is an inner silence, a silence that can be carried with us no matter what condition we find ourselves in. And it's a silence that's joyful, a silence that's happy. So even if we find ourselves in a space where we're practicing noble silence and we're with other people, it doesn't have to be this grim, don't make eye contact with anyone and, cultivating a miserable kind of silence that feels oppressive and heavy. But rather, we're cultivating this light-hearted, joyful, pleasant silence. The kind of silence that brings a smile to our face, even if we're not around others. So these wholesome ways of holding silence also then have their place and time. So the goal isn't to be silent 24/7 every single day of the year. We should be cultivating the ability to engage in wholesome, right speech. That is one of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, after all. But we also know that from time to time, we should try to quiet the mind and be with ourselves and see what that's like. See what it's like to not have distractions. See what it's like to just look at this body and mind and try to understand it fully, with all its pain, all its pleasure, with all the ways that it's imperfect and all the ways that it brings us joy, all the ways that it can bring up feelings of gratitude, but also sadness. And to be able to see all of these aspects of our experience and to then ultimately overcome them is only possible within the context of noble silence. So then the other side of silence is perhaps, the duality, the flip side, is the kind of silence that is ignoble, that leads to suffering. And this kind of silence that leads to suffering is obviously not one that the Buddha praises. And it's the silence of fear, the silence of engaging in unwholesome acts of body, speech, and mind. And it's interesting to think about that being silent in this way could be considered unwholesome, or being silent in this way could be considered dishonorable. But the different ways that the Buddha talks about this kind of silence has to do more with not doing what's wholesome, with not doing what's skillful. So holding back when one is actually able to be of benefit. For example, this morning during sutta study, we talked about how a lay follower is defined in the discourses. And there are different levels, different kinds of lay followers. And the best being the one that practices both for their own benefit as well as the benefit of others. And one of the examples of someone who does this is when they're accomplished, say, in generosity. They're a very generous person. And they encourage others to be generous as well. So this is one aspect of an ignoble silence. When we don't encourage others to practice the teachings, when we don't encourage others to live wholesome and fulfilling lives, then we're being silent on things that could benefit the people around us. So this doesn't mean going out and preaching to everyone you encounter, but instead it means looking for those times, places, and spaces where we can help the people that we know to live better lives. So when we see that our friend is suffering, we don't just ignore them. We don't just throw our hands up and say, well, I'm just worrying about myself. They don't need me. No, we help them. We don't stay silent in that situation. Instead, we follow the Buddha's instructions on speaking words that are worth treasuring, that are helpful, that are true, that go straight to the heart. We speak words that will be of benefit to the people we encounter. And so this is one way that staying silent is not useful when we find ourselves in a position to help someone else. Another way that the Buddha talks about silence being unwholesome is when people don't criticize things that are worthy of criticism. So this is interesting because oftentimes we can get the impression that as Buddhist practitioners, we're supposed to always be passive or peaceable. But that's not necessarily the case. Instead, we should be approaching every situation with wisdom, with clarity of mind, and seeing where there are wholesome things happening and rejoicing in that, and seeing where there's unwholesome things that are happening and being able to have the courage to point it out and say that that's not quite right. But this criticism of what is deserving of criticism is not with the intention to hurt or to harm, but rather with the intention to help. So this is constructive criticism, skillful criticism, criticism that's given at the right time with a mind of loving kindness. And this kind of criticism ultimately is trying to allow wholesomeness to arise. So if we see, for example, that someone is breaking the precepts, perhaps the precept on killing living beings by exterminating bugs, then we say, hey friend, why don't we find another way to do this that doesn't harm living creatures? Instead of allowing them to continue to do unwholesome actions, we can step in if we can. Obviously, it depends on the situation and you have to use your discernment and your wisdom. But we don't stay silent when we see that there's an opportunity for us to help someone choose wholesomeness, choose a path of good. So we see that staying silent in these cases does not lead to happiness, does not lead to peace, and does not lead to joy. When we see that there's something happening in front of us or around us that we can step in and help change, that we can help create into something wholesome, something beneficial. There's also the silence that comes with feelings of shame, feelings of despair, feelings of sadness. How often have we felt really bad about ourselves, and then out of that arose the desire to hide, the desire to lie about our state of mind and our feelings, the desire to disappear. So this is actually one manifestation of the craving for annihilation, the craving for destruction, the craving to not be. The Pali would be vibhava tanha. So you can examine your own experience and see if you're the kind of person that sometimes retreats into silence to avoid our experience. And again, this is not the point of being silent. The point of being silent is not to stir, steam, and stew within ourselves. The point of being silent is to be able to look at what's going on and do the best we can to confront it. So if we find that we're staying silent to avoid our experience or to wallow in feelings of sadness and low self-worth, then that's actually an opportunity where we need to speak, where we need to be honest with ourselves and with others about what's going on. So it's interesting then that you can look at these two sides of silence and see how in and of themselves, it's just different modes of acting, thinking, and speaking, or not speaking. But what makes them wholesome or unwholesome often has to do with the intention. So is the intention to help, or is the intention to hurt? Is the intention to confront, or is the intention to avoid? Is the intention to look at, or is the intention to look away? And once we start to see the motivation and the intention behind why it is that we're being silent, and see the effect that it has as well on the people around us, then we can start to see if being silent, one, is what we should be doing at any given time, and to see if we're actually benefiting from it. It's so easy to look at the Buddha's teachings and to pick, say, one aspect of the path or the practice as it's described, and to say that this is how it should be all the time in every single circumstance. But that's obviously too rigid a view. Instead, we need to look with discernment and wisdom and see when it is that it's the appropriate time to be silent, when it's the appropriate time to speak, when it's the appropriate time to get involved, and when it's the appropriate time to step back. And this, of course, takes trial and error, and inevitably we'll make mistakes even along the way. But what matters is each time we're learning how to apply silence to our lives in a way that helps us to develop in the practice. And if we see that we're becoming more joyful, more peaceful, more kind, more compassionate, and more wise because of being silent, then we're pointed in the right direction. Then we're heading towards enlightenment. But if we find instead that the silence we've been cultivating or experiencing is making us angrier, more hateful, difficult to be around, unkind, cold, and sad, then something needs tweaking, something needs to be looked at. It's also true that personality plays into this a little bit as well. So if you're more perhaps introverted, then you'll tend towards silence more often. If you're more of a hermit, then you'll tend towards silence. But again, it's important to look at what are we doing with that silence. If you're an introvert, are you avoiding situations by being silent? Or are you getting rejuvenated, refreshed? If you're a hermit type, are you just avoiding interactions with people, especially people you don't like? Or are you using that time in solitude and seclusion to develop the heart, develop the mind? And then if you're more extroverted as well, looking at how you're using speech. Are you using it as well to avoid, or are you using it to help and support? And can you find a silence that is just as nourishing as engaging with others? So the point in either case is not to beat ourselves up for being a kind of person that enjoys more or less silence, but rather look at how silence in each of our cases can benefit us. And for each person, mileage will vary. Someone will be ready for a year-long, completely silent retreat in the middle of nowhere with someone just to bring them food. Whereas for someone else, they can really just spend an hour with themselves. Either case is fine, because we're starting from where we are and trying to see how we can use these teachings on developing inner silence can help us progress on the path. So I think actually those are all the reflections that I'd like to share tonight on the topic of silence. There's obviously a lot that can be said about it, but those were some of the things that come to mind. So I hope those reflections have been useful in some way. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to type them in.